Before we get started, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like this video. That way, you'll always stay connected to our stories and never miss the next adventure. Bob had seen a lot of weird things in his 15 years working security across 3 different star systems. He'd broken up bar fights between species that communicated through bioluminescent flashes. He'd confiscated weapons he couldn't even identify without a hazmat team and a prayer. He'd once watched a diplomatic envoy from the methane breathers accidentally set off the fire suppression system during what turned out to be their version of a friendly greeting. But standing in the main docking bay of Meridian Gate Station, watching the sleek obsidian hull of a Ralmathi diplomatic vessel glide through the atmospheric shield like a knife through silk, Bob felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine, gut-twisting nervousness. "You look like you're about to face a firing squad," Reese said beside him, adjusting his uniform for the 3rd time in as many minutes. Bob's second-in-command was a good kid, competent and thorough, but he had the unfortunate habit of projecting his own anxiety onto everyone around him. "I'm fine," Bob said, which was a lie, but a necessary one. Security chiefs didn't get to be nervous. They got to be calm, collected, and utterly unflappable, even when the briefing materials included phrases like approval ritual and previous incidents have resulted in bloodshed. The Ralmathi. Bob had read everything he could find about them in the past week, ever since the station administrator had cheerfully informed him that Meridian Gate would be hosting their ambassador for a month-long negotiation. The Ralmathi were apex predators from a world where the food chain had exactly 2 positions: you or dinner. They looked like someone had taken a big cat, scaled it up to human size, given it opposable thumbs, and then decided that wasn't intimidating enough, so they'd added retractable claws that could punch through hull plating. They were also, according to the cultural briefing materials, absolutely obsessed with honor, territory, and something the translator software kept rendering as worthiness of space, which apparently meant that whenever they visited a new location, they brought their cubs along to assess the environment. And by assess, the briefing materials meant decide whether this place and these people are worthy of Ralmathi presence. And by decide, they meant the cubs, literal children, would make that determination through some instinctive process that nobody outside the Ralmathi really understood. And if the cubs didn't approve? Well, the briefing materials got a little vague there, but the subtext was clear. Diplomatic incident, potential violence, and a black mark on your career that would follow you to every backwater station in the Outer Rim. No pressure. The Ralmathi ship settled onto the docking platform with barely a whisper of displaced air. Bob had to admire the piloting. Most species came in hot and loud, all thrust and bravado. The Ralmathi moved like they did everything else, with the quiet confidence of something that had never needed to prove it was dangerous. "Security teams in position?" Bob asked, touching the comm unit in his ear. "Affirmative, Chief," came the response from 3 different checkpoints. Bob had personnel stationed at every access corridor, not because he expected trouble, but because preparation was the difference between a smooth operation and a disaster. The ship's boarding ramp extended, and Bob straightened his shoulders. He'd chosen to wear his formal uniform today, the one with all the commendations and service ribbons. It made him look more official, more authoritative, more like someone who knew what he was doing. Another lie, but again, a necessary one. The first figure to emerge from the ship made Bob's carefully maintained composure crack just a little. Ambassador Lyra was tall, easily 6.5 feet, with fur that shifted between gold and amber depending on how the light hit it. She moved down the ramp with a predator's grace, each step deliberate and controlled. Her eyes, when they fixed on Bob, were the color of molten copper, and they seemed to look straight through his uniform, his posture, his carefully prepared greeting, right down to whatever she was actually interested in seeing. Behind her came her entourage, 4 adult Ralmati, each carrying themselves with the same coiled spring readiness. And between them, darting and weaving like furry missiles with no concept of formation or dignity, came the cubs, 3 of them, small by Ralmati standards, which meant they were still the size of large dogs. Pip was in the lead, all golden fur and oversized paws, followed closely by Tallow, who had distinctive dark stripes across their back. Miri brought up the rear, smaller than the other 2, with one ear that flopped forward, in a way that would have been adorable if Bob wasn't acutely aware that those cubs had teeth designed to tear through meat. "Ambassador Lyra," Bob said, stepping forward and executing what he hoped was an appropriate bow. The cultural database had been frustratingly unclear about Ralmathi greeting protocols. "Welcome to Meridian Gate. I'm Bob, Chief of Security. We're honored to host you and your delegation." Lyra's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes suggested amusement. "Chief Bob," she said, and her voice was like honey poured over gravel, smooth and rough at the same time. "Your reputation precedes you. They say you run the most secure station in this sector." "I do my best," Bob said, which was both humble and accurate. He'd worked hard to build Meridian Gate's security protocols into something that actually functioned across dozens of species, with wildly different concepts of personal space, property rights, and acceptable conflict resolution. "We shall see," Lyra said. And that was definitely amusement now, playing at the corners of her mouth where her lips pulled back just enough to show the tips of very white, very sharp teeth. Bob was about to launch into his prepared speech about security procedures and station regulations when the cubs, who had been momentarily distracted by the docking bay's atmospheric processors, suddenly locked onto him like guided missiles, acquiring a target. Oh no. Pip hit him first, moving faster than something that size had any right to move. The cubs skidded to a stop directly in front of Bob, nose twitching, and then, without any warning or preamble, shoved their face directly into Bob's midsection and started sniffing. Bob froze. Every instinct screamed at him to step back, to put distance between himself and the predator, currently investigating his belt buckle with intense focus. But the briefing materials had been very clear. Sudden movements would be interpreted as either aggression or fear, and both were bad. So Bob stood there, arms slightly away from his sides, and tried to remember how to breathe while a juvenile apex predator catalogued his scent. Tallow joined in a moment later, circling around to Bob's left side and sniffing at his boots. Then Miri completed the triangle, approaching from the right and stretching up on hind legs to investigate Bob's security badge, which hung from his uniform pocket on a retractable cord. The badge! Of course they'd be interested in the badge. It was metal and plastic and electronics, foreign smells in a foreign place. And these cubs were trying to figure out if this strange, soft, furless creature was a threat or a curiosity, or something else entirely. Bob could feel sweat starting to bead on his forehead. The docking bay had gone absolutely silent. Reese, standing a few feet away, looked like he was about to have a heart attack. The Ralmathi entourage watched with expressions Bob couldn't read. And Lyra, Ambassador Lyra, stood at the base of the ramp with her arms crossed, her face carefully neutral. Pip grabbed the badge cord with one paw and tugged. Bob's heart rate, already elevated, kicked into overdrive. The cord was designed to retract, but Pip's tug was insistent, curious. The cub pulled the badge free from Bob's pocket, and held it up, turning it over, examining the holographic station seal that shimmered on its surface. Don't grab it back. Don't move. Don't breathe. Well, no, definitely breathe, but do it quietly. Tallow, apparently deciding that Bob's boots were less interesting than whatever Pip had found, abandoned the footwear investigation and padded over to join the badge examination. Now, two cubs were pawing at the security credential that Bob technically wasn't supposed to let out of his possession under any circumstances. Miri, meanwhile, had discovered something apparently fascinating about Bob's right leg, and was rubbing against it with enough force to nearly knock him off balance. Bob had grown up in the Canadian Rockies, back on Earth. His parents had run a wilderness lodge, and he'd spent his childhood learning to coexist with the locally predators. Black bears, cougars, wolves, the occasional grizzly that wandered down from the high country. His father had taught him the rules. Respect their space, don't run, don't make yourself prey, but don't make yourself a threat either. Be still. Be calm. Be something they can categorize as not food, not danger, just part of the landscape. Bob channeled every one of those childhood lessons now. He was a tree, a rock, a completely uninteresting feature of the environment that happened to be shaped like a human. Pip made a sound, something between a chirp and a growl, and offered the badge to Tallow. The second cub took it, sniffed it thoroughly, and then, in a move that nearly gave Bob a stroke, put it in their mouth. Oh, that's just great. Fantastic. His security credential was now covered in alien cub saliva. The station administrator was going to love the incident report on this one, but Bob didn't move, didn't reach for the badge, didn't do anything except stand there and let the cubs do whatever they were doing, because the alternative was a diplomatic incident that would probably end his career and possibly start an interstellar conflict. Miri, still pressed against Bob's leg, suddenly made a small sound of distress. Bob's eyes flicked down, and his ranger instincts kicked in before his security training could stop him. The cub was favoring one front paw, holding it slightly off the ground. Without thinking, Bob slowly crouched down, making himself smaller, less threatening. Miri watched him with wide eyes, but didn't back away. Bob extended one hand, palm up, moving with the same careful slowness he'd used approaching injured animals back home. "Hey there," he said softly. "What did you do to yourself?" Miri hesitated, then placed the injured paw in Bob's palm. The docking bay was so quiet Bob could hear his own heartbeat. He examined the paw gently, carefully spreading the toe pads. There, a small cut, probably from something sharp on the ship. Not serious, but enough to be uncomfortable. "You'll be okay," Bob murmured, still in that soft, calm voice. "Just a little scratch. Keep it clean, and it'll heal up fine." He released the paw and slowly straightened, and that's when he realized that all three cubs had stopped what they were doing and were staring at him. Pip had dropped the badge, Tallow had moved closer, and Miri was making a sound Bob had never heard before, a low, rhythmic rumble that seemed to vibrate through the deck plating. Purring. The cub was purring. And then all three of them were doing it, that deep, resonant sound that Bob felt in his chest, as much as heard with his ears. They pressed closer, rubbing against his legs, his hands, creating a small, furry circle of approval around him. Bob looked up at Lyra because he had no idea what this meant, and he desperately needed someone to tell him whether he'd just passed or failed whatever test this was. The ambassador's expression had changed. The careful neutrality was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like surprise. She stepped forward, her entourage parting to let her through, and stopped a few feet from Bob and his new fan club. The moment stretched. Bob didn't breathe, couldn't breathe. Everything, his career, the diplomatic mission, possibly the station's reputation, hung on whatever Lyra was about to say. The ambassador's mouth curved into a smile, genuine this time, showing more of those impressive teeth. "They approve," she said. Bob exhaled. It felt like the first real breath he'd taken in about 5 minutes. "You did not treat them as threats," Lyra continued, her voice carrying across the silent docking bay. "You did not treat them as children. You treated them as equals, as individuals worthy of respect and care. This is the Ralmathi way. This is what we value." Bob, still surrounded by purring cubs, managed a weak smile. "I just didn't want to get mauled on a Monday," he said. Lyra laughed. It was a sound like nothing Bob had ever heard, rich and full and completely unexpected. Several members of her entourage looked shocked. Reese looked like he might faint. "I like you, Chief Bob," Lyra said, still smiling. "I think we will get along very well during our stay." Pip chose that moment to retrieve the badge from where they'd dropped it, and, with great ceremony, placed it in Bob's hand. The plastic was indeed covered in saliva, and Bob was definitely going to need to sanitize it about 15 times, but he accepted it with as much dignity as he could muster. "Thank you," he said to the cub, who chirped happily in response. "Come," Lyra said to her entourage. "Let us see these quarters Chief Bob has prepared for us. I am curious to see if the rest of his station lives up to this promising first impression." The Ralmathi delegation began moving toward the docking bay exit, following the route Bob had marked out in advance. The cubs, after a final round of rubbing against Bob's legs, scampered after their elders, their earlier solemnity replaced by typical youthful energy. Bob stood there for a moment, alone in the docking bay, except for Reese, who approached with the expression of someone who'd just witnessed a miracle. "Chief," Reese said, his voice slightly strangled, how did you—" "I have no idea," Bob said honestly, looking down at his saliva-covered badge. "Absolutely no idea." The briefing materials said that 3 other security chiefs failed the approval process in the last year, Reese continued. "One of them ended up in medical for a week. And you crouched down and checked the cub's paw like it was a puppy." "It was hurt," Bob said, because that was the only explanation he had. The cub had been hurt, and his instincts had overridden his training, and somehow that had been exactly the right thing to do. "You're either the bravest person I've ever met or the craziest," Reese said. Bob finally looked up from the badge and met his second-in-command's eyes. "Can't it be both?" Reese laughed, the tension finally breaking. "Come on, Chief. We should make sure the delegation gets to their quarters without incident. Though honestly, after that, everything else is going to feel like a vacation." Bob followed Reese toward the exit, his legs feeling slightly unsteady. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a growing awareness of just how badly that could have gone. But it hadn't gone badly. The cubs had approved. Lyra had laughed. And Bob had somehow, through a combination of childhood lessons and dumb luck, passed a test he hadn't even fully understood. As they walked through the corridors of Meridian Gate, Bob's comm unit chirped. He tapped it, expecting a status update from one of his security teams. Instead, he got the station administrator's voice, practically vibrating with excitement. "Bob, I just watched the docking bay feeds. That was incredible. The Ralmathi ambassador actually laughed. Do you know how rare that is? This is going to be amazing for the station's reputation." Bob closed his eyes briefly. "Glad I could help, Administrator. I'm sending a commendation to your file right now. Outstanding work, Chief. Truly outstanding." The comm clicked off, and Reese grinned at Bob. Commendation. Nice. Yeah, Bob said, looking down at his badge again. All I had to do was let alien cubs use my security credential as a chew toy. Easy. They reached the guest quarters, where the Ralmathi delegation was already settling in. Bob could hear the cubs inside, their excited chirps and growls echoing through the open doorway. Lyra stood in the corridor, speaking with one of her advisors, but she looked up as Bob approached. "Chief Bob," she said, "a moment of your time?" Bob nodded, and Lyra gestured for him to follow her a short distance down the corridor, out of earshot of the others. "I must be honest with you," Lyra said, her voice lower now, more serious. "The approval ritual is important, yes, but it is not the only reason I chose Meridian Gate for these negotiations." Bob felt his security instincts prickling. "Oh?" "I chose this station because of you," Lyra said. "Your reputation for integrity, for fairness, for running a secure facility where all species are treated with equal respect. These qualities are rare, Chief Bob, and they are qualities I will need in the coming days." "I'm not sure I follow," Bob said carefully. Lyra's copper eyes fixed on him with that same penetrating intensity from the docking bay. "The negotiations I am here to conduct are delicate. There are those who would prefer they fail. I suspect there may be attempts at sabotage, at interference. I need someone I can trust to help me identify and stop such attempts. Someone who operates outside the normal diplomatic channels." Bob felt his stomach sink. "Ambassador, with respect, my job is to maintain station security. I enforce protocols and regulations. I'm not an investigator or a spy." "No," Lyra agreed. "You are something better. You are someone who sees clearly, who acts with integrity, and who, as you demonstrated today, knows when to follow instinct rather than protocol." She paused. "I am asking for your help, Chief Bob. Not as a security officer, but as someone I believe I can trust." Bob looked at this alien ambassador, this predator in diplomat's clothing, and saw something in her eyes that he recognized. Genuine concern, maybe even fear. Whatever these negotiations were about, they mattered. They mattered enough that Lyra was willing to ask for help from someone she'd met less than an hour ago. "I'll need to know more," Bob said finally. "Everything you suspect, everything you know. And I'll need to bring Reese in on this. He's my second, and I trust him completely." Lyra nodded. "Agreed. Come to my quarters tonight, after the station's evening cycle begins. We will talk then, away from curious ears and watching eyes." "Tonight," Bob confirmed. Lyra smiled again, that same genuine expression from earlier. "The cubs were right about you, Chief Bob. You are worthy of trust." She turned to rejoin her delegation, then paused and looked back. "Oh, and you may wish to clean your badge. Pip is teething, and their saliva can be somewhat corrosive to certain metals." Bob looked down at his badge, which was indeed starting to look slightly pitted where the cub had mouthed it. "Fantastic," he muttered. Reese appeared at his elbow. "Chief, everything okay?" Bob tucked the damaged badge into his pocket and started walking back toward the security office. "Define okay," he said, "because I think we just went from hosting a diplomatic delegation to getting involved in some kind of interstellar intrigue, and I haven't even had lunch yet." "It's not even 1000 hours," Reese pointed out. "Exactly," Bob said. "It's going to be a very long day." Behind them, from the Ralmathi quarters, came the sound of cubs playing, their happy chirps and growls echoing through the corridor. Bob smiled despite himself. Whatever was coming, whatever Lyra needed his help with, at least he'd started the day by not getting mauled. Small victories. He'd take them where he could get them. Bob's office was a study in organized chaos, security monitors displaying every major corridor and junction on the station, incident reports stacked in neat piles, and a coffee maker that had seen better days but still produced something vaguely resembling caffeine. He sat at his desk, staring at the requisition form for a new security badge, and tried to figure out how to explain damaged by alien cub saliva in official terminology. Reese leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "So, are you going to tell me what the ambassador wanted, or am I supposed to guess?" Bob looked up from the form. "She thinks someone's going to try to sabotage the negotiations." Sabotage. Reese straightened. "Here? On Meridian Gate?" "That's what she said." Bob pushed the requisition form aside. "She wants our help investigating. Off the books." Reese was quiet for a moment, processing. "Chief, that's not exactly in our job description. We maintain security. We enforce regulations. We don't do covert operations." "I know." Bob rubbed his eyes. "But she's right about one thing. If there is a mole, they'll be monitoring official channels. Any formal investigation would tip them off immediately." "And if we get caught running an unauthorized investigation?" Reese asked. "The administrator will have our heads, not to mention what it could do to the station's reputation if it looks like we're playing favorites with one delegation." Bob stood and walked to the window that overlooked the station's central plaza. Below, dozens of species moved through the space. Humans, Forlians with their distinctive amphibious features, the crystalline methane breathers in their environmental suits, even a few of the insectoid Orlpesh collective members that Lyra was supposedly here to negotiate with. "The Ralmathi are negotiating an alliance with the Orlpesh," Bob said. "Lyra didn't give me all the details, but she made it sound critical. If someone's trying to stop that alliance, and they succeed because we didn't act, what does that do to the station's reputation?" Reese joined him at the window. "You're saying we're damned either way." "I'm saying I'd rather be damned for doing something than for doing nothing." Bob turned to face his second. "But I need you on board with this. If you're not comfortable, I'll understand. I can handle it alone." "Alone?" Reese snorted. "Chief, you just survived first contact with predator cubs by checking one's injured paw. Your decision-making is clearly suspect. Someone needs to watch your back." Bob smiled. "Is that a yes?" "That's a yes." Reese moved back to the desk and pulled up a chair. "So, where do we start?" "Tonight," Bob said. "Lyra's going to brief us on everything she knows. Until then, we act normal, run standard security protocols, nothing that would raise suspicion." "Normal," Reese repeated. "Right, because today has been so normal so far." Bob's comm unit chirped. He tapped it, expecting another status update. Instead, he heard the distinctive chirping sound of a Ralmathi cub, followed by Lyra's voice, slightly exasperated. "Chief Bob, I apologize for the interruption, but Pip has apparently decided that your badge was a gift and is now searching the station for you to return it. Could you possibly come to Section 12 and explain to them that you still possess your credential?" Bob and Reese exchanged glances. "On my way, Ambassador," Bob said. As they headed for the door, Reese shook his head. "You know what? Investigating a potential sabotage plot might actually be the least weird thing that happens today." "Don't jinx it," Bob said. They found Pip in Section 12, nose pressed to the floor, tracking Bob's scent with single-minded determination. The cub looked up as Bob approached, chirped happily, and immediately began sniffing his pockets. Bob pulled out the cleaned badge and showed it to Pip. "See? Still got it. You didn't take it permanently." Pip examined the badge, seemed satisfied, and then did something completely unexpected. The cub gently head-butted Bob's leg, purred once, and scampered back toward the Ralmathi quarters. Lyra, who had been watching from a distance, approached with an expression Bob was starting to recognize as amused approval. Pip was worried they had stolen from you. Cubs take honor very seriously, even at that age. Good to know, Bob said. Ambassador, about tonight. 200 hours, Lyra said quietly. Come alone, or with Reese if you trust him. No one else. Understood. Lyra nodded and followed Pip back toward her quarters, leaving Bob and Reese standing in the corridor. Well, Reese said, at least the cubs like you. Small victories, Bob muttered. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine security tasks, but Bob's mind kept circling back to the evening meeting. What exactly had Lyra gotten him into? And more importantly, was he really prepared to go off-book? To bend the rules he'd spent his entire career upholding? He thought about the cubs, about their instinctive trust, about Lyra's genuine concern. Sometimes, he realized, doing the right thing meant stepping outside the lines. 200 hours couldn't come fast enough. 200 hours found Bob and Reese standing outside the Ralmathi quarters, both trying to look casual, while internally running through every worst-case scenario. Bob pressed the door chime, and Lyra answered immediately, as if she'd been waiting right on the other side. Come in, quickly, she said, ushering them inside. The quarters were larger than standard diplomatic suites, modified to accommodate Ralmathi preferences. Lower lighting, warmer temperature, and furniture that looked more like elevated platforms than chairs. The cubs were nowhere in sight, presumably sleeping in an adjacent room. Lyra gestured to a low table where a holographic display was already active, showing what looked like communication logs and personnel files. Thank you for coming. I know this is irregular. That's one word for it, Bob said, settling onto one of the platforms. It was surprisingly comfortable. So, what exactly are we dealing with? Lyra's expression turned grim. The alliance between the Ralmathi and the Orlpesh Collective represents a significant shift in this sector's power balance. We offer military strength and territorial security. They offer technological advancement and resource networks. Together, we become formidable. Which means someone doesn't want you together, Reese said. Precisely. Lyra manipulated the holographic display, bringing up a timeline. 3 weeks ago, when negotiations were first announced, incidents began. Small things at first. Scheduling conflicts that seemed accidental, communication delays, minor technical glitches. Nothing that couldn't be explained away as normal station operations. Bob leaned forward, studying the timeline. But the pattern suggests otherwise. Yes, the incidents always occur at critical moments. A power fluctuation during a secure transmission. A life support hiccup in the conference room minutes before a meeting. A food delivery mix-up that resulted in one of the Orlpesh delegates becoming ill. Nothing serious, but enough to delay proceedings. Someone's playing a careful game, Bob said, causing disruption without being obvious about it. Lyra nodded. I have been monitoring the situation, but discreetly. I cannot afford to appear paranoid or accusatory. The Orlpesh already view emotional displays as weakness. If I make accusations without proof, the alliance fails regardless. Reese was scrolling through the incident logs on his personal datapad, cross-referencing with station records. Chief, look at this. Every single incident occurred during shifts worked by the same maintenance technician, Tommen, from the Forlian contingent. Bob felt his stomach tighten. Tommen had been on Meridian Gate for 6 years, longer than Bob himself. The Forlian was quiet, competent, and had never caused a single problem. Pull up his file. The holographic display shifted, showing Tommen's personnel record. It was spotless, perfect attendance, commendations for efficiency, not even a minor disciplinary note. Too clean, Bob muttered. What? Reese asked. It's too clean. 6 years on a station this size, dealing with dozens of species and constant technical issues, and not one single mistake? Not one complaint? Not even a sick day? Bob shook his head. Nobody's that perfect. Lyra's eyes narrowed. You think the record has been altered? I think it's worth investigating. Bob stood and began pacing, his mind working through possibilities. But we need to be smart about this. If Tommen is our saboteur, confronting him directly will just make him go to ground. We need to catch him in the act. A trap, Lyra said. A trap, Bob agreed. We feed false information through channels we know he has access to. Make him think there's a critical meeting or transmission happening at a specific time. Then we watch and see if he takes the bait. Reese was already pulling up duty rosters. I can arrange for extra monitoring on the systems he'd need to access, hidden protocols that won't show up on standard logs. Do it, Bob said. But keep it quiet. If there's a mole, we have to assume they're watching for exactly this kind of response. They spent the next 2 hours planning, going over every detail, every possible contingency. Lyra provided information about the Orlpesh delegation's schedule, and Bob mapped out security coverage that would appear routine but would actually create a surveillance net around Tommen's usual work areas. It was nearly midnight when they finally finished. Bob stood to leave, exhaustion pulling at him, but Lyra stopped him with a hand on his arm. Chief Bob, I must ask, why are you doing this? You could have refused. You could have insisted on official channels. Why risk your career for negotiations that do not directly involve your species? Bob thought about the question, about the easy answers he could give. Instead, he told the truth. Because this morning, 3 cubs trusted me enough to let me check an injured paw. Because you trusted me enough to ask for help. And because I've spent my whole career believing that security isn't just about enforcing rules, it's about protecting people. All people, regardless of species. Lyra's expression softened. The cubs were right about you. Let's hope so, Bob said, because if this goes wrong, we're all going to have a lot of explaining to do. Back in the corridor, walking toward their own quarters, Reese was quiet for a long moment before speaking. Chief, what if it's not Tommen? What if we're wrong? Then we keep looking, Bob said. But my gut says we're on the right track. That record is too perfect. Someone's been very careful to make Tommen look like the ideal suspect. You think he's being framed? Bob stopped walking and turned to face Reese. I think someone wants us to think it's Tommen, which means either he's guilty and overconfident, or he's innocent, and someone's using him as a distraction. So, what do? We spring the trap, Bob said. But we watch everyone, not just Tommen. Whoever's behind this has been smart so far. Let's see how smart they are when the pressure's on. They reached the junction where their paths diverged. Reese heading toward his quarters, and Bob toward his. Get some sleep, Bob said. Tomorrow we set everything in motion. Sleep, Reese repeated with a tired laugh. Right, because that's going to happen. Bob watched his second walk away, then continued to his own quarters. Inside, he collapsed onto his bunk without bothering to change out of his uniform. His mind was racing, running through scenarios, looking for flaws in their plan. His comm unit chirped softly. Bob almost ignored it, but years of training made him check. It was a text message from an unknown sender. "The cubs sleep soundly. May you do the same. Tomorrow brings challenges. Be ready. Lyra." Bob smiled despite his exhaustion. The ambassador had a flair for the dramatic. He closed his eyes, but sleep was a long time coming. Somewhere on this station, someone was working to destroy an alliance that could reshape the sector. And Bob had just committed himself to stopping them. Rules and regulations be damned. His father's voice echoed in his memory, a lesson from childhood. "Sometimes, son, doing the right thing means stepping off the trail. Just make sure you know why you're doing it, and be prepared for where it leads." Bob knew why. He just hoped he was prepared for where it would lead. Outside his window, Meridian Gate continued its endless rotation, a small point of light and life in the vast darkness of space, home to thousands of beings from hundreds of worlds, all trying to coexist in the fragile peace that stations like this represented. Worth protecting, worth the risk. Bob finally slept and dreamed of cubs with copper eyes and purrs that shook the deck plating. The trap was set for the following afternoon. Bob had arranged for a critical secure transmission between Lyra and the Orlpesh delegation's home world, scheduled for 1400 hours in Conference Room 6. The information had been carefully leaked through 3 different channels that Tommen would have access to. A maintenance request for the room's communication array, a catering order in the station's food service system, and a scheduling update in the public diplomatic calendar. If someone wanted to disrupt the transmission, they'd have a clear target and a narrow window of opportunity. Bob watched the security feeds from his office, Reese beside him, both of them nursing cups of terrible coffee and pretending this was just another routine day. The hidden monitoring protocols Reese had installed were active, tracking every access point to the systems that controlled Conference Room 6. 1,300 hours came and went. Tommen appeared on the feeds, moving through his normal duties, checking environmental controls in Section 9, responding to a minor power fluctuation in the docking bay. Nothing unusual. 13:30. Still nothing. "Maybe we're wrong," Reese said quietly. "Maybe there's no mole. Maybe Lyra's just paranoid." Bob didn't answer. His instincts were screaming that something was off, but he couldn't pinpoint what. The feeds showed normal station activity. Personnel moving through corridors, ships docking and departing, the usual organized chaos of a diplomatic hub. 13:45. Tommen entered a maintenance shaft near Section 12, carrying a standard repair kit. The shaft had access to the power conduits that fed Conference Room 6. Bob tensed. "There," Reese said, leaning forward. "He's going for it." But something nagged at Bob. Tommen's movements were too obvious, too easy to track. If he was really a saboteur who'd been operating successfully for weeks, why would he suddenly become so careless? "Pull up the other feeds," Bob said suddenly. "Everyone who has access to those conduits, everyone who's near that section." Reese's fingers flew across the controls. Multiple feeds populated the screen, showing various personnel in and around Section 12. Most were going about normal business, but one figure caught Bob's attention. Elora, a human administrative assistant, standing in a corridor junction with a datapad, apparently reviewing schedules. Except she'd been standing in that exact spot for 8 minutes, barely moving, her eyes not on the datapad, but on the maintenance shaft entrance where Tommen had disappeared. "Her," Bob said, pointing. "Pull up her file." Elora's record appeared. She'd been on Meridian Gate for 8 months, transferred from a smaller station in the Outer Rim. Her performance reviews were adequate but not exceptional. Nothing remarkable, nothing suspicious, nothing too perfect. Check her access logs for the past 3 weeks, Bob ordered. Cross-reference with the incident timeline. Reese worked in silence for 30 seconds that felt like hours. Then his face went pale. Chief, she accessed the systems for every single incident, but the logs were altered to show Tommen's credentials instead of hers. Bob was already moving, grabbing his comm unit. All security teams converge on Section 12, Junction 4. Detain the human female with the datapad. Non-aggressive approach, but don't let her access any station systems. He was out the door before Reese could respond, running through the corridors with the kind of speed that made other personnel flatten themselves against the walls. His mind raced ahead. If Elora was the mole and she realized they were onto her, what would she do? Run? Fight? Trigger whatever sabotage she'd planned as a final act of defiance? Bob rounded the corner into Section 12, just as Elora looked up from her datapad, her eyes widening as she saw him approaching with 2 security officers flanking him. For a moment, she froze, and Bob saw the calculation in her expression. Fight, flight, or surrender? She chose flight, spinning and sprinting toward the nearest access corridor. But Bob had anticipated that, had positioned his people to cut off the obvious escape routes. She made it maybe 10 meters before running straight into Reese, who'd taken a parallel corridor and emerged ahead of her. "It's over, Elora," Bob said, approaching slowly, hands visible and non-threatening. "We know what you've been doing. We know you've been sabotaging the negotiations." Elora's face crumpled, and to Bob's surprise, she didn't try to deny it. Instead, she sank to the floor, her back against the wall, and started crying. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "They have my family, my parents, my sister, they're all on Earth. And these people, they said, if I didn't help them, if I didn't stop the Alliance." Bob felt his anger deflate slightly, replaced by something more complicated. "Who? Who's threatening your family?" "I don't know their names," Elora said, wiping at her eyes. "They contacted me 6 months ago, before I even transferred here. They knew things, personal things, things nobody should have known. They said the Ralmati and Orlpesh alliance couldn't happen, that it would destabilize the sector, and if I didn't help stop it, my family would pay the price." Reese had his datapad out, already tracing communication logs. "Chief, I'm seeing encrypted transmissions from her quarters to an unknown source. Routing, through multiple relays, but I might be able to backtrack them." Bob crouched down to Elora's level. "Listen to me. If you cooperate, if you help us identify who's behind this, I'll do everything I can to protect your family. But I need everything. Names, if you have them, communication records, what you were planning to do today." Elora nodded, still crying. Today was supposed to be the big one. A cascade failure in the conference room's life support. Nothing lethal, but enough to make the Orlpesh think the station wasn't secure, that the Ralmathi couldn't guarantee their safety. It would have ended the negotiations. "Would have," Bob said, "but it's not going to happen, because you're going to help us turn this around." He stood and pulled Elora to her feet, gently but firmly. "Reese, get her to a secure holding room, not a cell, somewhere comfortable, and get me a direct line to Lyra. She needs to know what's happening." As Reese led Elora away, Bob's comm unit chirped. It was Lyra's voice, tight with tension. "Chief Bob, the Cubs are missing. They were in their quarters, and now they're gone. My people are searching, but—" "On it," Bob said, already moving. "Where were they last seen?" "Their sleeping area. But the door was sealed. They couldn't have left without—" Bob's blood ran cold. "Without someone letting them out. someone who wanted to create a distraction. He switched channels. All security teams, priority alert. 3 Ralmati cubs are loose on the station. Find them, but do not approach aggressively. Repeat, non-aggressive contact only. And someone check on Tommen. Make sure he's actually where we think he is. The response came back within seconds. Chief, Tommen's unconscious in the maintenance shaft. Looks like he was stunned. And there's a device attached to the power conduit. Some kind of overload trigger. Bob started running again, this time toward the maintenance shaft. Disable it, carefully, and get medical to Tommen's location. Everything was happening too fast, spiraling out of control. Elora had been caught, but whoever was really behind this had anticipated that possibility and created multiple layers of chaos. The sabotage device, Tommen as a backup patsy, and now the cubs as hostages or distractions, or worse. Bob reached the maintenance shaft and climbed down, finding Tommen slumped against the wall with a security officer already checking his vital signs. The Forlian was breathing but unconscious, a small burn mark on his neck from a stun weapon. And attached to the power conduit, exactly as reported, was a device that Bob recognized from his training. A cascade overloader, designed to create a feedback loop that would fry every system connected to this junction. Not just Conference Room 6, half the station's critical systems. Can you disable it? Bob asked the technician who'd arrived with the security team. The technician, a young human named Paige, examined the device with a handheld scanner. Maybe. But Chief, this thing has a tamper trigger. If I make one wrong move, it goes off immediately. Bob's mind raced. They needed time, needed to evacuate the affected sections, needed to find the cubs and figure out who'd actually planted this device. But time was the one thing they didn't have. His comm unit chirped again. This time it was a voice he didn't recognize, filtered through heavy encryption. Chief Bob, I believe you're looking for 3 small Ralmathi. They're safe, for now. But if you want them to stay that way, you'll step away from that device and let it do its job. The alliance ends today, one way or another. Bob's jaw clenched. Who is this? Someone who understands that some alliances are too dangerous to allow. The Ralmathi and Orlpesh together would shift the balance of power in ways that cannot be permitted. Walk away, Chief. This isn't your fight. Everything that happens on this station is my fight, Bob said. And if you've hurt those cubs, they're unharmed. They'll remain that way if you cooperate. You have 5 minutes to clear your people from Section 12. After that, the device activates. The negotiations end in chaos, and everyone goes home disappointed but alive. Or you can try to be a hero, and we'll see how many people die when half the station loses power. The comm went dead. Bob looked at Paige, at the device, at the unconscious Tommen. 5 minutes. Not enough time to evacuate properly, not enough time to disable the device safely, not enough time to find the cubs, but maybe enough time to do something incredibly stupid. Paige, Bob said, how long would it take to reroute the power flow? Isolate this junction so the cascade can't spread? 10 minutes, maybe 15. But Chief, you heard them. We have 5. Then you'd better work fast, Bob said, because I'm not letting some faceless terrorist dictate terms on my station. He switched comm channels. Reese, I need you to trace that last transmission, find out where it came from, and get Lyra somewhere safe. If this goes wrong, it won't, Reese said, and Bob could hear the determination in his voice. We've got this, Chief. Bob hoped he was right, because in about 4.5 minutes, they were going to find out just how good his instincts really were.